we've known for over 200 years that this unique diet, I'd call it one of the most powerful therapeutic nutritional strategies that we know of, called the ketogenic diet, was actually used to prevent and reverse obesity, type 2 diabetes, and actually save the lives of patients with type 1 diabetes going all the way back to 1796.
Dr. Andrew Koutnik, when it comes down to a keto masterclass, like what people should expect in each phase, what they should do, what they can expect to feel, what they are going to do, what they should eat, their macronutrients, you are the scientist to turn to. So we're going to make this keto masterclass. So Andrew, jumping right into it, someone is just starting keto. What can they expect? What is happening in their body the moment they start removing the carbohydrates?
Yeah, so I guess we should first define keto for those who might be brand new to it. So the ketogenic diet is a diet that is very low in carbohydrates, typically estimated around less than 50 grams per day, that ultimately has this robust shift in your metabolism and your physiology that increases ultimately this product called ketone bodies. The sequence of things that occur when you first go on to a ketogenic diet is, I like to think of it in three simple phases. One is essentially what happens in the first 24 hours to maybe up to around 7 days, to what happens up to around the 4-month mark, and then what happens beyond that point. And for people to understand the common changes that occur with a ketogenic diet, they must understand these three phases. And the first phase is when someone goes into a ketogenic diet, the first phase they can anticipate is, one, they're eating less glucose or carbohydrates. So you would typically around 4 to 6-fold less. So the body's getting much less glucose almost immediately. So you can actually see in the very first meal, less glucose entering the body. As a consequence, that triggers the most important biological change in the body, which is a drop in insulin. Insulin is the most powerful hormone in metabolism. And when someone starts the first meal of a ketogenic diet, a very low carbohydrate meal, insulin is dramatically lowered. In fact, we see that over time, people will reduce their overall 24-hour insulin anywhere from 33% to 75%. So dramatic reductions in the amount of this powerful anabolic hormone in the body.
So before you continue on that, like who would benefit from this reduction in insulin? Like who would benefit from starting this before we get deep into any weeds with this?
Yeah, that's a great question, because I don't want to oversell this as some magic, but at this stage, at least the United States of America and the rest of the world is unfortunately catching up to us. If you were to be in a room full of people right now, Tom, 9 out of 10 adults in that room will have some form of metabolic derangement. Now, what does that mean? That means that their waistline is enlarging. Their blood glucose levels are starting to elevate in their blood. Their blood lipids like triglycerides are starting to elevate. These are key markers that something is wrong in your body. Your health is starting to slip away and deteriorate. And that, and multiple studies have shown over the years that around 9 out of 10 Americans are experiencing some form of metabolic derangement. But we know that up to over 68% of adults now have some form of obesity in the United States. So around 7 in 10 adults have obesity. We know that things like cardiovascular disease, prediabetes, around over half of Americans experience this. We know that the incidence of serious mental illness, which has an underlying component of things like metabolic derangement. That's mine. You want me to have?
Oh, yeah, you're good. That's
okay. We see that serious mental illness is experienced in about a fourth of all adults, so 1 in 4. Alzheimer's has gone up around 200% in the last 4 decades. So these are alarming rises in chronic disease, but amongst all of those, there's a central theme amongst them. And that central theme is altered metabolism. I would reframe it as metabolic derangement. And one of the most powerful ways to change metabolism is to change the food that you eat. So we've known for over 200 years that this unique diet, I'd call it one of the most powerful therapeutic nutritional strategies that we know of, called the ketogenic diet, was actually used to prevent and reverse obesity, type 2 diabetes, and actually save the lives of patients with type 1 diabetes going all the way back to 1796. So it's been around for a long time as a powerful therapeutic tool, but now the evidence has emerged that it can mitigate the symptoms of things like cognitive decline, Alzheimer's disease, Parkinson's. There's actually fascinating emerging evidence that shows that, although it's preliminary, but up to 6 to 7 different reports showing that some patients with serious mental illness like bipolar, depression, schizophrenia can actually go into remission on this diet. In fact, there's 11 active clinical trials underway right now actually exploring this phenomenon of this dietary approach. So I would contend to your question that the overwhelming majority of Americans, if you have some form of diagnostic or diagnosed chronic disease with a metabolic central theme that is inducing or contributing to that disease, or you're just experiencing early signs of subclinical change like elevations in glucose and prediabetes, that the overwhelming majority of Americans today could benefit from improving their metabolic health. And this is one of the oldest and most reliable ways that we know of to accomplish that.
Jeez. So if we come back to this whole insulin question, or not insulin question, but you were explaining before I rudely interrupted you about, those massive reductions in insulin. So many of these conditions that we're talking about, it seems as though insulin plays a big part in this, right? This chronically high circulating level of insulin. So when someone removes the carbohydrates from their diet and the first thing they see, as you were saying, is this massive reduction in insulin, can they expect to feel anything in that short term, or is reducing insulin something that takes a little bit longer to feel? I recommend having like some salt or some salty electrolytes. I put a link down below for the ones that I use. Helps a ton when you're fasting or when you're calorically deprived, where you're trying to just reduce calories in general. So that is called LMNT, and that link gets you a free sample variety pack with any purchase. Okay, so with any purchase, you get a free pack of electrolytes that you can keep for yourself, you can give to your friends. It's a pack of their leading flavors. So this is cool because you're getting kind of a freebie with it. But I'm telling you, with 1,000 milligrams of sodium, it does curb your appetite. I can say firsthand, I've been using it for 7 years, like when I fast or when I'm reducing calories, game changer. So try adding something like that in if you're trying to reduce calories instead of maybe a diet soda. It's a good alternative.
You would expect to feel differences within the first 7 days. I mean, things like appetite would change. We know that the reduction of insulin, because insulin is such a powerful anabolic hormone, it pulls in water into your cells, it pulls in sodium into your cells, that when you reduce it, you're reducing glucose levels, you're reducing the amount of glucose elevations and spikes. It's kind of variability in your metabolism. You're also, as a result, you also often lose a tremendous amount of water weight as well. We know that individuals within the first 5 to 6 days can lose around 2% of their body weight. So for the average American male, that's around 4 pounds within the first week. For females, that might be around 3.5 pounds. Whereas that consistently progresses all the way up to around the 2 week to 4 week mark, where they can lose up to, for males, up to 6 pounds, and females up to around 4.5 pounds. And that's just in water weight alone until it normalizes. But appetite changes. The impact of changing food is almost immediate, because a lot of the foods that we consume, they will impact glucose levels. They'll impact insulin levels, both of which have a direct impact on our neurobiology and how we feel at each meal of every single day, which is analogous to if someone were to go to lunch and they go out to a deli restaurant or eat a sandwich, and then all of a sudden they feel like they need to take a nap afterwards. What is driving that effect, that, oh, I feel tired, I feel fatigued, is glucose and is insulin. So immediately you're reducing glucose levels, and you're also reducing the insulin levels into what I would argue is a more stable level of both those molecules. The two most important molecules, I would argue, in all of metabolism.
So if we're looking at, insulin driving hunger, driving all these sort of feelings, does that mean that, if people have this chronically high circulating insulin all the time, 9 out of 10 people, essentially, 9 out of 10 people are probably having distorted hunger signals and altered metabolism, in the sense that they're not really even able to discern like whether they're hungry or not. Because insulin's kind of making you feel this way all the time, right?
Well, yes. So we know that insulin has a direct impact on the brain. We know it has impacts on virtually almost every tissue in the body. So there's no doubt that changing insulin levels, at least dramatically reducing them, would have a profound impact on how you feel and also various aspects of your health. We know that just simply gaining weight. So why are we in the state we are in America with metabolic health being as poor as it is? Well, many people are gaining more and more weight. And one of the first things that happens before you even see a signal in the blood is, because most people don't usually measure this, is you, upon just starting to gain weight. So let's say you first get obesity, you start gaining excess fat tissue, insulin levels double. As you progress and further in obesity, that can double, quadruple, it go up sixfold until ultimately you have a degree of inflammation, oxidative stress, and all these metabolic changes in amino acids and lipids in the blood that ultimately facilitate this final signal of elevations in glucose levels, which is usually a byproduct of multiple years of derangement, which is usually a signal of something like prediabetes or very progressive down the line of type 2 diabetes. So when you ask, like, can someone immediately see a difference? Right out of the gate, glucose levels are lower and the exposure to them is 4 to 6-fold lower. Insulin levels will drop around 33 to 75%. That's the anabolic hormones, the fat storage hormone, that reduces. That sets off a cascade of changes. One that most people are probably heard of is this elevation in fat burning. That sounds very appealing to people, but it's very true. When insulin lowers, insulin's really the blockade on breaking down the fat tissue you have on your body and utilizing that now for fuel instead of relying so heavily on glucose and carbohydrates for fuel. And so that happens. The first signal of that is we see systemic changes in the amount of reliance on carbohydrates down to about 50% of the normal level, so reduces 50%. And we see in a lot of the studies that we have run that fat oxidation for the average person over starting around the first 5 to 7 days, progressing all the way to week 4, that you see this progressive elevation in the amount of fat that's being oxidized up towards 100 to 200% on the average person. But in some individuals, we see increases in the amount of fat that's burned, particularly like during exercise, 300 to 400%. And all these changes are progressively happening over time. We know that a lot of them begin to hit normalization or plateaus at around the 4-week mark. A lot of our studies have actually shown that around that time frame, we see that glucose levels begin to normalize. Okay, after they initially drop, they begin to normalize around 4 weeks. Ketone levels begin to rise within the first 18 hours. But as they rise, they get to a peak level right after 3 weeks and begin to normalize right along glucose levels. And around that 4-week window, when these metabolites start to normalize, unsurprisingly, we also see other functional changes start to normalize. We see physical performance start to normalize again. We start to see all these muscle turnover, so the amount of muscles being broken down and synthesized begins to normalize as well. We start seeing things like appetite, how full you are from a meal begin to initially see changes within the first 7 days, but then that also begins to normalize. So around the 4-week mark is that second phase where you see all these rapid changes within the first 24 hours that progress to around 7 days. All of those changes begin to progress over time up to the first 4 weeks. And at the 4-week mark, you see this homeostasis or this normalization of glucose, ketones, the amount of fat that you're burning, the amount of carbohydrates you're burning, and also the sodium and water retention levels, again, drop precipitously and then normalize. And so that's why we also believe we see these normalization of physical performance as well in even high level and even Ironman competitors that we have looked at in long-term studies. And that's the second phase. The final phase, the third phase that we anticipate are these longer-term changes that we don't have specific timelines on. So for example, there's a lot of literature that says that the amount of glycogen or stored glucose in the muscle drops quickly because when you're exercising or engaging in activity, you replenish that with insulin and glucose. But we also see that it progressively restores over time. But it usually appears to take over 4 weeks in duration to really see a true normalization, at least in athletes. For individuals who aren't athletes, we see that as long as you maintain your calories, you don't have high levels of physical activity, you may not see much of a difference at all. But we don't see that this impairs performance at all. So we've studied ketogenic diets for 4 weeks in high intensity, really close to max effort, 1 mile time trials to as fast as possible, really, really difficult short-term aerobic efforts to 6 by 800 meter sprints. And we see the ketogenic diet, as long as you stick to it for 4 weeks in duration, we see no impaired performance. Same thing with Ironman competitors going to the opposite extreme, where you go for, you ride at a strenuous, prolonged exercise bout up to 70% of your VO2 max for as long as your body can maintain before you reach fatigue. And that's typically in the athletes that we studied who are Ironman competitors, over 2 hours in duration, some north of 4 hours in duration. We see that these athletes also do not experience any impairment in performance as well when going to extremely long durations. So we really see this normalization period despite altered glycogen levels, despite these dramatic shifts in the amount of fat that's being burned, the amount of carbohydrates that you now rely on has been reduced. And you really reach this state of homeostasis around the 4-week mark. So when most people initiate this diet, they'll see rapid changes in weight and insulin and glucose. You start to build up fat burning potential, reduce your reliance on carbohydrates. That progresses and really hits a new normal around the 4-week mark. And some things progress even longer than that.
So within those first 4 weeks, is there a specific sort of macronutrient guideline that people should pay attention to? Do things change as we get through these 3 different phases? And if you're in, this phase 1, I have one, question before we get into maybe the specifics. You're dropping this water. Obviously, some of it is, from glycogen because you hold water. But part of me can't help but wonder, are we just losing some just inflammation too? It just seems like, yeah, you might drop some of this, intracellular water, but I can't help but wonder if there's more than that. Because every time that I initially start a ketogenic diet and I drop that water, sure, it looks good. Sure, that's great. You drop that excess water. But it is noticeably different in the joints. It is noticeably different. Like it feels like inflammation just drops.
So that's a really interesting question, because we have looked at long-term randomized controlled trials of a ketogenic diet. And what we see is that around 70% of those trials have shown some type of anti-inflammatory response, or improvement or reduction in inflammation is maybe the more appropriate way to describe it. So what you're describing is evidence-based. It does appear that that's the case, but it's hard to dissect because people are losing weight, which we know also reduces inflammation. They're seeing less insulin, which can reduce inflammation depending on particularly if you had elevated insulin, which most of Americans do, at least American adults do. So it's absolutely anticipated that you would see some potential anti-inflammatory response. But we also know that this elevation of this very unique metabolite called a ketone body, which if you've ever heard of that, you probably heard a lot of interesting things about it. The simple elevation of this unique metabolite that's, broken down from it, breaking down your fat goes to your liver. Your liver has this unique machinery in it that converts that fat into this very special nutrient or metabolite that circulates around in your blood, which can now fuel up to over 60 to 70% of your brain during very low carbohydrate or prolonged periods of things like fast. These metabolites have been discovered to directly block certain inflammatory pathways, to alter the way that your genes work by changing what they call epigenetic signaling. We also know that produces an enhanced antioxidant capacity. We also know that these molecules, when present in the blood, are used preferentially by the brain in a dose-dependent manner. And in multiple studies that we've run, we've actually even taken ketone bodies in people who haven't even changed their diet and just given them exogenously, these things called exogenous ketone bodies. And we have seen in many of these studies, even in healthy individuals, that they're seeing improvements in cognition. So the way their brain performs and functions. And this is very particularly interesting because when you go on a ketogenic diet, this is one of the most reliable signals that, in fact, you're adhering to the diet and seeing the important physiologic and biological changes that we know accompany this diet. So it's often, when someone asks, how do I track that I'm on track with this diet, that's actually working? Well, there's three main things when it comes to this diet to actually think about when first embarking on it. Number one is, are you eating the right foods? So when someone's first embarking on this diet, the ketogenic diet, and actually I'm going to flip this back to you, Tom, because you have a ton of experience this both personally and have talked about this maybe more than anyone has out there when disseminating information to help people on this diet. The three main things that I think about, and I want to see what the things are that you prioritize, is first, getting the nutrients or macronutrients right. So one of the first things I think about is just getting the carbohydrates low enough, typically less than 50 grams a day, then getting the protein as a second layer of component to that, typically, 1 gram per pound of body weight or 20 to 25% of total calories. And then many people don't count their fat. They just are consuming it as a part of the diet. But that might be very different depending on the person's goals. So what's your experience, Tom, with this, having done this for years and also helped many people along this journey?
Yeah. For that first 4-week period of time, I think cardinal rule number one is obviously, getting the carbs as low as possible. And the lower that you can be in that initial period, probably the better, right? I mean, you're just getting yourself to just cold turkey, get into shifting gears. I am a little bit more in that first 4-week period, more inclined to go with monounsaturated fats, MCT oil, things that break down into ketone bodies a little bit faster. But I'm not a fan of skyrocketing the fats early on. I think that used to be 2015, 2016 is kind of what we would say is like, oh, and you're going into the ketogenic diet, like increase your fats. I haven't seen any evidence that directly says like in that first 4-week period, like the higher your fats, the more dose dependent response you're going to have with ketones per se, above a certain point, right? So it's not like if you start drinking 1,000 grams of fat, from pure oil, you're going to magically create more ketones because you're not at a state where you're producing them super efficiently anyway yet. So I would usually say, yes, definitely make a concerted effort to add the fats, but don't try to reach any astronomical number per se. There is evidence, I do know, that like a monounsaturated or a polyunsaturated, depending on the type of fat, obviously, will turn into a ketone body faster, which, could put you in a spot as you are trying to produce ketones to maybe produce them a little faster. But if people are up for it, I mean, one of the best ways to get yourself into that state where you're optimized is just to, start out with a 16 to 20 hour fast those first couple of days. I mean, nothing's going to kick you into gear faster than that. And then after that, you can start paying attention a little bit more to your types of fats. I think for the pragmatic application of it, people usually just like to substitute something, right? They're removing carbs. So giving them a little bit of amnesty to enjoy some bacon or extra fats is, in my opinion, a little more psychological than anything, because you're removing something that they've probably been having for an entire lifetime, and that can be difficult. So at least pacify the fact that like that's probably not very fun for that person by saying, all right, go for it, have the bacon, have the fats, like go to town. I think that helps them out psychologically with adherence, especially through those first few days when things are a little rocky.
Well, so Tom, it's also something that I deeply align with, because when I think about initiating this diet, for particularly some of the kind of higher end athletes that I worked with before, but also in the research, I have found that when you think about, the breakdown of this diet specifically, that it's very individualized for the person, right? So, and what I find is just starting with a foundation of simple principles, like the amount of carbohydrates that you might need, the amount of protein that you might adhere to, and then allowing for the rest to kind of come along. Or for an athlete, you might want to be very careful about not allowing for calories to drop too low. I also will say that I very much align with the old story around the ketogenic diet, was that people were promoting as like, you can eat anything you want. Like you need all the fat in the world. And I think that was a mistake. I think that it was a mistake to say, fat can't make you fat. I mean, like, look, if this was full of pure olive oil and you just drank it all day long, there's no way that that's not going to potentially contribute to some level of calories and weight gain. But the concept of this diet is typically one where most people are interested in it because they think it can make their journey to, let's say, lose weight or feel better. In your case, you mentioned inflammation. We know that the molecules like ketone bodies have an anti-inflammatory response, antioxidant response. People think clear. And so a lot of times they're on this journey because they just want to feel better. And having the simplest path to doing that is often the best path for most people. What would you say is one of the common pitfalls that people encounter that you've seen on this diet that you've tried to help people from walking into?
I'd say, especially in the first 4 weeks, it's electrolyte imbalances for sure, because I don't know if people fully understand what that feels like, right? Especially if you take someone that perhaps isn't an athlete and they've never experienced what it feels like to be out of whack with electrolytes. It can be a scary feeling. It can feel, it's a shapeshifter, right? It can take the form of just fatigue. It can take the form, like I think most people think I'm dehydrated or my electrolytes are out of whack, but I'm cramping. But you don't have to be cramping, right? Like that's one attribute. That's one thing that happens when your electrolytes are out of whack. The first thing that really happens is cognitive, right? I mean, you're not connecting the dots the way that you used to. You're not able to, regions of the brain aren't communicating the way that they normally do. You feel off, you feel irritable, you feel all these things. You start having a doom and gloom outlook. There's depression, there's all this. And when you are in that hole and you are viewing it through those lenses or through that lens, it's really difficult to look your way out of it. So, I can't tell you how many times people over the last 10 years that have started a ketogenic diet within that, especially that first week, their electrolytes are out of whack. All of a sudden insulin levels are low. So you're urinating more and you're losing more electrolytes. That you have to make a concerted effort to add more sodium in. And that is just a very important thing in that first week. But I'll also, CYA on that, like the further you get into a ketogenic state, which I think we'll talk about as we get into like probably stage 2 and 3, that becomes a little less important. When insulin levels initially drop, you lose a lot of water. You do have to add more sodium in, and it may feel a little bit weird, but you'll find that everything just starts to function better. So that's probably the biggest thing, and that deters people. That like scares people. They're like, I knew it. I knew I wouldn't feel good without carbohydrates. Everyone else was right. Yep, you need to have carbs. Reality is, I would almost put money on it. It's an electrolyte thing.
And that's something when you look at the literature on electrolyte changes, it's, upon insulin dropping is the second you start not holding on or retaining as much sodium and water, and you're excreting not only sodium, but also potassium and some other minerals as well. But one of the common ones, of course, is sodium. And some people recommend to have anywhere between 3 to 5 grams per day, or even potentially supplementing with additional 1 to 3 grams on top of that.
Especially if you're exercising.
Exactly. For the first, let's say, 2 to 4 weeks, when we see in the literature, at least, that things start to normalize again with electrolytes. How long do you think people should be supplementing with these? Because the literature says 2 to 4 weeks is when things come back to normal. The water loss from sodium and lower insulin starts to balance out around the 4-week mark. Do you agree with that? Is that what you've seen as well?
I think we are right to assume that it balances at that point. However, keep in mind that you're not having these transient increases in insulin that are happening like you normally would with glucose intake, right? So even though you find a new homeostasis, like normally your homeostasis would sort of change with every meal on a standard diet, right? Because you have 100 carbs here, you have 100 carbs there. So you have this transient increase in insulin, which is going to cause, again, all these different, sodium gated channels and different things that allow that glucose in that require sodium. So it's, in other words, to put it in human terms, is when you have carbohydrates, certain carbohydrates require sodium to even get in. So it's like there's this like sort of mutual demand, right? When you are on a ketogenic diet, even after things have stabilized, you are now not eating these foods that spike insulin. So the delta of the amount of salt that you need to take in just to maintain function is still going to be higher. So even though it's highest in those first few weeks, I would still, if I could go out on a limb and say just in 10 years of experience of doing the diet, I would say probably a 30% increase in sodium above what you would normally have seems about right.
And I will also say, like, personally, as someone who's done the diet for over 10 years as well, for managing my type 1 diabetes and also trying to do that along with performance-based initiatives, that I always flavor my foods to taste with salt. So I don't ever hold back with it. And there are some times where I will purposely provide it. And usually that's around exercise. I don't try to overdo it though, because I feel like I'm getting it throughout my diet. But I've also found that my reliance on that drops dramatically the longer I am on this diet. But another thing that I see that is often, I think, a predictable, but also preventable pitfall of this diet, besides just not anticipating the initial shifts in minerals that you need to supplement with, especially the first 2 to 4 weeks, when people get fatigued or headaches or other things that can be mitigated just by having sodium alone, is that people are often not aware that, sometimes just taking, or at least I think this is a recommended approach, looking at your food that you're already eating. Because you mentioned this before, people want to have the bacon and the steak, and because it provides this appeal to the diet, kind of like if you could eat nothing but pizza all day diet and it helped you, that would probably appeal to a lot of people too, if it worked. Probably doesn't, but if it worked. But I've found that when you look at someone's diet and find the things that are already in it that are aligned with a ketogenic diet and using those as your foundation, and then looking at the other foods that someone has in their diet that they're missing. Let's say that they miss bread, okay, or they miss once in a while having some type of dessert. I've found that when they're prepared to understand that they can make low carbohydrate based breads, that they can make some other forms of foods and supplement the things that they're missing, that prevents people from having issues with long-term sustainability, feeling like I can't maintain this because I want to have this thing I can't have anymore. And I think allowing people to build a foundation upon the foods that already fit the diet, that they already had, and then finding alternatives that are readily available all over the internet because of the popularity of this diet is another way to help improve sustainability over the long term. Do you agree with that or do you disagree with that?
Yeah, no, that's exactly. If you look at most people are eating things that are already perfectly acceptable on a ketogenic diet. There's just the addition of this one macronutrient that shouldn't be there in that case.
Okay.
So if you just say, okay, if you look at this plate of food, what do you like on that? Well, I really like the cheese. I really like the bacon. I really like that, beef patty on there. Man, I love the avocado. I love the tomato. I love the mayonnaise. The only thing that's going to be missing is that baked potato. Like, can you live with that? As a matter of fact, you can even have the butter and the sour cream that's on that baked potato. Just lose the potato. It really frames it in a way where people are like, that's really not that bad. And especially, I look forward to periods when I'm on a strict ketogenic diet. I'm on one right now. And it allows you to eat out in a way that you ordinarily can't even eat out at a restaurant. You can go almost anywhere and get a burger patty. You can get these things and you just get it without a bun, right? But if I was doing just a calorie restricted diet, it's extremely hard. It's extremely hard to be like, okay, please give me a baked potato. Don't put anything on it. Okay. And then please give me a chicken breast. Make sure that it's not cooked in any extra oil. And then it's just, it is much more cumbersome. No one even looks at you funny if you order things in a sort of ketogenic lower carb style. So it's all about the framing. I think when there's the framing of this, we're taking away your carbs, then it puts people on the defense. And that's just simple human psychology, that's going to make people defensive and it's going to make them feel like something's getting taken away rather than, we're enhancing your diet by letting you eat all the things that you love or just simply kind of moving this one over. When someone is in this first phase, I want to make sure we hit on this. Is there a recommended style of exercise to induce ketogenesis better?
So the way I think about it, and I'm actually curious to hear your take on this, Tom, as well, is because a lot of people don't, we exercise and we're part of, the fitness community and the research community around this, the healthcare community, whatever you want to call it. So a lot of people in this space are very familiar with exercise being beneficial to health. So they do it a lot, but the average person often could benefit from just doing it at all. And so for me, one thing that I often encourage people to think of when they're first starting this, particularly those who aren't already athletes, is just to do something at all. So just being purposeful for at least 30 minutes, ideally a day, to try to do some form of physical activity. It doesn't matter the type. Just to do something you enjoy. Because if you enjoy it and you're doing physical activity, you're better than if you didn't. And a lot of the ways I think about this is, people I'm sure have heard of the 80-20 rule, but if you can get 7 days of the week, 80% right when it comes to the nutrition with the ketogenic diet and also just doing exercise to some degree, let's say 80% times 7 days a week, that's 560. Whereas if you only did it 100% perfect 3 to 4 days a week, that's 350. 560 versus 350, you always win with doing 80% of the things right 7 days of the week. And so that's what I think most people should focus on. So when I think about your question about exercise, just do anything you can do. But if I want to be very particular, I think the greatest overall health benefits that someone could experience is doing a combination of both resistance exercise and aerobic exercise. They do diverse things on the body. Resistance exercise builds muscle. It has a dramatic increase in insulin sensitivity. These are powerful and important effects for longevity, for overall health, for function, how you look in the mirror. That's important. But we also know that cardio or aerobic-based exercise, running, walking, swimming, these are very important for cardiovascular health. And I would argue that you don't want to negate that. I think it's very important to also partake in that because there is literature. This is one of the first things that I ever studied back over almost 20 years ago, or 15, 20 years ago, was looking at the impacts of just resistance exercise or just aerobic exercise. And those who do just aerobic exercise are missing out on all these benefits of a resistance exercise, where those who are just doing resistance exercise, actually there's some signals that, yes, you get stronger, there's health benefits associated with it versus if you didn't, but it also, because of the high pressure of people, holding and gritting and pushing, can actually cause higher blood pressures just during the exercise. But how does your body adapt to that? It actually stiffens the arterial wall, the vascular wall. And we know that aerobic exercise alongside resistant exercise completely offsets that effect. And so I think that doing both is important. Does one contribute to higher levels of ketosis for the other? Yeah, we know that just doing long duration aerobic exercise without even a ketogenic diet can increase ketone production. So I would contend that probably aerobic exercise would lead to higher levels of ketone bodies. But I think it's important for people to realize they should be doing both for overall health. That's my take. How would you see it?
No, I fully agree on that. And one thing that I will tell people a lot of times, especially when you're first starting a ketogenic diet, is that the diet in and of itself, and don't take this too far, but is somewhat of an exercise mimetic, right? Like, it is not saying that you have a license to not exercise, but people that are just getting started, if it's an entire lifestyle change for them, and that a lot of times is what happens. Like, someone gets an insulin resistance diagnosis, diabetes diagnosis, and they look to the ketogenic diet. And first off, let me say, like, applaud those people that actually get that kind of diagnosis and then say, okay, a ketogenic diet's the way, right? Because there's a lot of people that will just go the pharmaceutical route and not look at that at all. So sometimes it's a lot to say, hey, go start this diet and start this exercise routine. It's worth mentioning that the benefits of a ketogenic diet in the absence of exercise are still huge, right? It lends itself quite well to sedentary people that are already living a sedentary life, because just the dietary shift alone, you don't have to change a whole lot else. So again, not a license to not exercise, but during that transition period, if it's too much to swallow, I've definitely known people be like, fine, start with the diet, because once the inflammation comes down, once the body starts feeling good, once the brain has this sort of backdoor way of getting fuel into the mitochondria in the brain, and all of a sudden you have this new lease on life, you want to work out, you want to move. I'd almost rather it go that way, where it's their choice because they feel good, rather than being like, okay, I'm starting this diet, I'm starting the ketogenic diet, I need to exercise to produce ketones as much as possible. Someone that has been inactive and is metabolically dysfunctional is going to see 60% of the improvement just by getting on that diet first. And then, if exercise comes later, then hell yeah, and it absolutely should. But, don't think that you have to do this to get more ketones. I don't know if the juice is always worth the squeeze for a lion's share of people. It's better to just say, hey, let me start on the diet. Let me get through this rocky phase. It might not be fun to try to work out when you're dealing with electrolyte imbalances. Just roll through and get going for a couple of weeks and then start.
So I'm really glad you said that, because I want to give a story first, but then also shift into some of the research on exactly what you're saying, which is my wife ran her first marathon in the Redwoods in Northern California. And I remember waiting at the end of the finish line, and she's coming through, and there's another gentleman who came through, and my wife and this other guy had been kind of pacing a lot of the race. So they had built up a little bit of conversation. And so they were all of us were talking afterwards. And the gentleman was heavier. He was clearly obese. And he said, I run every other weekend. I do a marathon every other weekend. And I was like, so how do you train for that? He's like, well, I just do this, and I do these gels throughout, and I do this, and I do this. And it was just, I left me with a really profound mark that he is doing one of the most, for many people, something they'll never accomplish, which is running over 26 miles nonstop, and not only doing it, not just once, but he's doing it multiple times, and is struggling with obesity. And what a large multi-country analysis of over 30 different geographical populations, dramatic diversity from some prominent research groups around the world, what they found is that when they looked at what is driving excess body weight. So they were really more so focused on honing in on the obesity epidemic worldwide. What they found was that when they looked at these different populations, and they looked at physical activity and exercise versus caloric intake and food and nutrition diet. And what they found was that over 90% of the obesity epidemic could be explained by diet alone. And in fact, the other 10% wasn't a lack of physical activity. There was subtle changes in energy expenditure. So you're 100% on point that if someone's at least focused on improving their body composition, which the overwhelming majority of America is, then you have to do the diet.
Yep.
It is insufficient based on the evidence that most people will ever just exercise and see the results they want. They have to do the diet.
100%.
And people often use the saying, you can't outrun a bad diet. It's just one of the oldest cliches, and a little controversial cliche, but it's actually evidence-based. It's completely true. When thinking about what do you prioritize initially? And I will say that I think it is wise for people to consider, if they are just starting something, to start the most important thing, the hierarchical, most powerful lever they can pull. And oftentimes that alone is the diet. Tom, what would you say are some other key components? Because someone might be wondering, okay, well, I'm a little concerned about animal products, plant versus animal-based foods on this diet, or having packaged versus unprocessed foods or whole foods. Where do you stand on the quality of the composition of the foods within the diet? What's optimal and what's, bare minimum threshold for what you think most people should be looking towards when doing this diet?
When I started a ketogenic diet, it was, I guess it would have been like 2010 when I first did it. And there weren't a lot of ketogenic processed foods available. So by default, it was probably 80 to 90% whole foods anyway. It was like, okay, I'm just eliminating carbs. So it was a lot of meat, a lot of veggies, a lot of cheese, a lot of oil, a lot of avocado, a lot of things like that. And I, by far, had the best success during that period of time. It wasn't until like more keto treats and things came on, which really begs the question of just a hyperpalatability thing, because you can make anything hyper palatable, right? Whether it's ketogenic or not. Because I think we just saw with the I just did a video on this. So it was like that March 2025 sucralose hypothalamus study, right?
Yeah.
And that wasn't even necessarily to be a hit piece on sucralose, but what that taught me with that study is like, okay, we've battled this all the time, like online, about diet sodas, good, bad. The bottom line is, like, in that study, there was no change in insulin between like water and sucralose. It didn't do this whole cephalic insulin response and stuff we've been concerned about. It's probably a moot point, but what it did do is it lit up the brain like a freaking Christmas tree, and it made them want to eat. And what that tells us is that it doesn't matter ketogenic or not, the more processed that it is, it's probably going to encourage you to eat more. And I could make a solid argument that ketogenic processed foods are even more dangerous because they're going to be calorically dense, because they're more operative on fat, right? So you're looking at fat, so they're much more calorically dense. So if they are lighting up here, Chris, if you took two people and lit up their brains equally, one with, a bunch of traditional processed foods that are maybe not as calorically dense compared to some ketogenic and super calorically dense, there's a good chance that the amount of calories that person would consume could be like 3 to 4x, right? Just because of the caloric density. And there's all kinds of different thermic equations and things that we could factor in, depending on how you want to get, obviously, because like when insulin levels are lower, I believe you're granted a little bit of slack, but probably not as much to the degree of like what someone could eat in like really dense keto cereals that are 400 calories per serving.
I call them keto candy.
Yeah. I mean, those things are nice to have as a treat, but they're still hyper palatable. So my usual rule is in that first 4-week period, like just avoid those things, right? So lean into the meats, lean into the cheeses, lean into the dairy fat. If you're not a big meat eater, like we have countless studies over the last like 3 or 4 years, especially, that are just talking about like the benefits of dairy fat are, you can hardly find a negative outcome, right? Like it's really, really positive on dairy fat. All the just different carbon chain fats that you have there, the different myristic acid, the different, what's the big one? CLA, like, okay, so all these different ones that have fat loss benefits too. So, if you're not a big meat eater, If you're vegan, it's a different story, but lean into the dairy fats. These kinds of things are a great source in the beginning. And then as you get into these other phases, then I think it's okay to kind of bring those keto treats in now and then, but they shouldn't be the beginning staple. And most people don't crave them in the beginning. I purely think it's a psychological thing where it's like after a period of time, there's all these different signals we get, right? Like, so when you drink a diet soda or a bubbly soda, even it's like the bubbliness on your tongue satisfies your brain in a way. So I think sometimes on a ketogenic diet, people start to miss the crunch. And so they start looking for ways to get the crunch. But, I would recommend just keeping it as whole food as possible for that first period of time. Give your body the baseline nutrition that it needs, which can be hard, but, just set yourself up for success when you can just have a baseline whole food, not bringing the processed stuff in.
And to piggyback off that, that's kind of a diet that I think almost everyone should be doing. There's so many things within processed food products that even someone who's gotten a PhD in biomedical and nutrition-based fields, I can tell you, I still walk into the grocery store and I'll look at foods that say keto-friendly or zero sugar on the label. And I've eaten one that has the same exact calories. They both say keto-friendly. They both say zero sugar. Same calories on the label. Same carbohydrates on the label. Same fiber. Same protein. Same fat. It's identical calories, Tom. And I'll eat one. No effect on blood sugar whatsoever. I'll eat the other one. It spikes my blood sugar up over 100 milligrams per deciliter, increases my insulin over 300%. And so if you have to be careful with trusting some of the foods that are out there, because there are some nefarious actors who very purposely just change sugar on a label for a chemical sugar or a syrup, molasses or honey or a natural sugar like molasses, honey, maple syrup, or one of these other ingredients that is almost identical to its metabolic effect as sugar. Obviously, some may be slightly better to the average person, but on a ketogenic diet, those are all to be avoided. And so to just remove that uncertainty, like, oh, I've been eating ketogenic, but I just can't produce ketone bodies. Well, are you eating? That's one of the biggest things that I see with people is that they will often eat these foods that are labeled keto friendly because they don't always understand, the hundreds of thousands of different food products and how that it actually, what's the macronutrients, how many carbs, fat, and protein. They don't know these things. And so they're looking at a food product that says keto friendly. And they're like, oh, that's going to fit on my diet. When in reality, some of these food labels are tricking you. I also agree that there's plenty of evidence that even 0-calorie sweeteners, the sweeter it is, the more it can stimulate a hunger response. And I've actually personally experienced this. I actually cut out I completely whole foods, locally gathered, even so much as removed allergen-based foods, not because I had an allergy, just because I removed everything, right? Things that could be an allergen for people, dairy, some people have a nut allergy, I removed it, not because I had it. I don't have these allergies, but I was just curious. And I reintroduced it after 30 days. It's actually something people could try called Whole30. But nonetheless, I remember the first day after finishing that, and I just added 1 drop of a non-caloric keto-friendly sweetener. And I remember not really caring to finish the coffee during that 30-day window when I didn't have any additional sweeteners and flavors because I didn't really seek it. But then I added just a sub-perceptual level of sweetness that I couldn't even really taste. It was just present. And I wanted to have 3 different cups of coffee. It was powerful how much that little bit drove me to eat. But I'll also balance that off by saying, I think it's really important to have balance in this approach, right? Like when people are first engaging on this, is it better to have a Coke Zero than a real Coke? Yes, that is a huge improvement. Is it better to have water than a Coke Zero? Yes, it is. And so, the more you can move down the less processed, less unknown ingredients, the more you can actually get your own food, make your own food from whole food sources, the less you're making guessing. And also is an informative process for someone who's doing this. But I would argue, no matter what diet you're on, that's a smart strategy. People may be asking as well, what are the beverages that I can consume? A lot of times I tend to say, water, coffee, unsweetened teas, but people may be asking, what about sodas? What about alcohols? What's your take on that?
I think that if it allows you to keep the carbohydrates lower, during this first phase, then I would probably go on a limb and say it's fair game, right? I'm not a big fan of consuming a bunch of diet sodas. I think that they're going to stimulate you to want to eat more. But if you're going from a regular Coke to a Diet Coke, I mean, realistically, you're probably going to be fine. But it's one of these things where I think that the ability to stay on the diet and the true sustainability of it is probably going to take precedence over trying to alienate certain things, right? Like we both know Dr. Ben Bickman. I mean, I talked to him at length about this, and like he even said from an insulin perspective, he's like, look, I'm not a fan of drinking a Diet Coke. He's like, but in a moment of indulgence, I'll absolutely have it. And I will certainly have it 100 times over a regular Coke. So I think putting people's mind at ease with that, putting those couple drops of stevia or monk fruit in your coffee or using those are simple things, right? When I'm talking about the processed keto stuff, I'm talking about like literally keto candy, like stuff that's just going to be maltitol and, all these other things that, but I think getting yourself through that phase is really important, especially with the beverages. Because I think just from a caloric perspective, the beverages are like, I don't want to call myself an aficionado with it, but like, that's how I restrict calories is I go to like, what are these different like cool things that I can do, different teas I can drink, different yerba mates. I get creative with different like beverages because it's a great way to reduce calories, especially like if you're fasting and things like that. Yeah. So I think that there's a lot of slack to be given there. But I have one question before we move into maybe phase 2 and kind of what people can expect during that phase and how maybe their diet should shift or can shift. And that's, based on what you've seen in the research, can you say that when insulin levels are lower, there is a shift in how many calories people can get away with eating?
That's a great question because we know that just by lowering carbohydrates on 2 different diets, one's lower in carbohydrates, one's higher in carbohydrates, that you can actually see changes in weight and energy expenditure just by lowering carbohydrates alone. There was actually an interesting study by David Ludwig where over time they measured the energy expenditure over a long-term ketogenic diet. And we know that by doing the ketogenic diet, you're lowering glucose exposure, lowering insulin. But if you match the calories, you still can see that some individuals were seeing increased energy expenditure of up initially around 50 kcals per day up to 150 kcals per day over time. And obviously over multiple days that could accumulate to some additive benefits. So I guess more so what you're getting at is there things independent of calories just by lowering insulin that are important. And I think the answer is absolutely 100% yes. I think that by lowering insulin, because it's the most powerful hormone in all of the body, higher and higher levels, particularly for those who are overweight or experiencing obesity, maybe they've gone so far as to have type 2 diabetes and insulin resistance. We know that molecule alone at higher levels leads to insulin resistance, leads to changes at the insulin receptor, insulin signaling, that lead to increased risk. Higher and higher insulin is not a good thing. Zero insulin, obviously, can kill you in the case of what is type 1 diabetes, the disease that I live with every single day. Over 100 years ago, before insulin was discovered, patients would usually die in the absence of insulin. And so you need some, but one could say that you want the least amount possible to thrive, not just to survive, because we want to thrive every day. You don't want to just make it past, barely make it through the day. You want to actually feel like that you had a great day. You really thrived throughout the day. And but yes, there are critical aspects to insulin that are independent of calories alone. And just having lower levels is usually a good bet in general for overall health and well-being.
Yeah. I'll speak from like right now, I've been on strict ketogenic diet for about a month again. My diet before was about 2,600 calories per day. I'm eating 3,400 calories per day, and I've lost almost 10 pounds in the last month. And my activity is lower. I don't know how to explain that, right? So now I'm very keto adapted from years of doing a ketogenic diet, then going off. So maybe my body, I think this is where we need to have a lot of slack for like how we talk about this, because it's just like the bio-individuality really matters. My body's like, okay, cool, we're doing this again. Let's rev up all these gears. Let's get fat burning again. and it's like clearly thermodynamics are not applying the way that like I thought they would apply. So I go on a ketogenic diet because I can actually eat more and not gain weight, which is interesting. And I don't necessarily have a scientific explanation for it, but I know there's a lot of people that are, feel that way. So it's a difficult, very heated discussion to ever have, but I can speak from my own personal anecdotal experience.
Yeah.
I'm eating like 700 calories or so more. It's bizarre, but that would probably plateau over time, but it does show that, maybe there's some mitochondrial flux that's occurring. Maybe there's some, different efficiency. Maybe there's a different heat exchange. Maybe there's more non-exercise activity thermogenesis. Maybe I feel better. So I'm simply moving more. But, this is coming off of quite literally being in Europe for 2 months, walking 40,000 steps a day, coming home, doing a ketogenic diet, increasing my calories significantly, and walking 10,000 steps a day. So not only have I increased my calories, but my non-exercise activity thermogenesis, I would bet $1 million. It's gone down significantly, and I'm still have dropped weight and not lost muscle.
So let's call a spade here, Tom. Most people think you're absolutely crazy saying that.
Yeah.
So, and especially in the science community, which, I'm heavily involved with and engage with actively, they'll say you're crazy. Calories in, calories out, that it is, you're defying physics by saying what you're saying, and that there's some other explanation for that. However, we clearly know that there are factors independent of calories alone that facilitate, things like body weight. We've known this for a long period of time. This isn't new. We know that calories are a really, really, really important pillar
In a closed thermodynamic system.
Yes.
Sorry.
Yeah. No, 100%. No, hit it, Tom. Go for it.
Yeah.
That's true. But there are other variables that contribute along the way that we know for certain impact these other variables. Look no further than, women going through perimenopause and menopause, where they start to gain weight despite eating the same amount of calories and exercising the same. These are hormonal shifts and swings that are occurring, and that is independent of calories. Okay, like that's an independent of calorie effect. We know that there's a laundry list of those factors. So I have evolved my thinking because I very, very much did align with, physics matters and thermodynamics matters and calories in, calories out. But it's a much more nuanced conversation where calories are a really important pillar of that overall effect. But it's one of many things that contribute together. Yeah. And yes, you can lose calories eating complete and you will lose weight. But you can also eat more calories and change your diet composition and lose weight too. So there's something that has to explain those factors or circumstances that are outside the mean.
Yeah.
And we know that there's a host of variables now that evidence has shown that contribute to that. So I totally align that there are factors independent of calories, independent of insulin, that can lead to or change body composition, body weight, that it isn't just a calories in, calories out conversation. It's definitely a more nuanced conversation than that component. But so let's say for you, Tom, after you've gotten past the first, you changed your diet, you're seeing these initial changes in glucose, insulin, and you start ramping up fat burning and reduce your reliance on carbohydrates, and you go into this next phase of the ketogenic diet window up to, let's say the 7 days to the 4 week window, is, what would you say is important about that window for you? But also I would ask, because we haven't addressed this yet, what would you be tracking during this period of time, trying to make sure that you are in fact seeing these changes, that you are in fact biologically inducing a state that we know this diet induces called ketosis? What would you say for that?
Yeah, I'd say during the first, 2 weeks, I'll just use regular keto strips, the ones that you urinate on. They're in the first 2 weeks. But after the first 2 weeks, we know there's a little bit of the level of adaptation in the ketone strips, just as a caution, like those really measure excess ketones, right? So,
yeah.
once your body's more efficient at creating ketones, you're not going to produce excess ketones anymore. So, when you're peeing on those strips, it alarms a lot of people. But for the sake of like ease of use and making sure that like my diet is where I want it, in the first 2 weeks, I will just pee on the strips, because otherwise you got to prick your finger all the time, which I totally don't mind doing to test ketones. That's the gold standard, is testing your blood. But in the first 2 weeks, for me, it's all about, is my diet in check? And I would rather just pee on a strip and make it easy. So that's usually what I pay attention to. Am I in, dietary ketosis based on these strips? And that usually happens very fast. Within a couple of days, I'm producing ketones, sometimes within 1 day. I do make a concerted effort in the first 4 weeks to not overconsume protein, not because I think the protein is going to like turn into glucose and kick me out, but I do want to give my body every opportunity necessary to create as many ketones as possible. And I don't drive my fat intake up, but I do keep my protein down to about like 30-ish% during that phase. And then as I transition, which we'll talk about in a second, sort of that second month, then I bring my protein up closer to about 50% of my calories on a ketogenic diet.
To interrupt for the audience, why would you want to lower protein? What impact does protein have to prevent ketosis from happening?
Yeah. So, and we'll definitely talk about this because it's a huge part of probably, I'm going to guess, phase 3, when you start getting into like glycogen resynthesis and you start getting into, but it's this thing that everyone sort of fears, this gluconeogenesis thing, where your body takes other substrates, either glycerol or protein or amino acids, whatever, and turns them into glucose. Okay. Bottom line, I think what people are getting here is that if your glucose goes to 0, you're dead, right? Your glucose ain't going to 0. You're on a ketogenic diet. It's all about keeping the glucose stable by giving an alternative fuel. So with that, your body's really good and becomes very efficient at using these other sources of, substrates to make glucose. And sometimes that can be protein. But gluconeogenesis, people usually don't need to be as concerned. It's very much so demand driven, not supply driven. But in those early stages, I haven't seen research on this, but I am a believer that in those early stages of ketosis, for someone that's never done it before, that protein does seem to slow sort of that increase into ketosis. But once someone is deep in that ketosis state for a couple of months, unless you're going really high protein, like really, really high, it doesn't seem to affect it that much, because it seems as though, without getting too dense in this, it's primarily driven by glycerol, by fatty acid backbone. So when you are burning fats, this backbone from the fatty acids or from the triglyceride is broken off, and that's what's driving most of gluconeogenesis. So essentially, more fat you eat or more fat you burn, the more glucose will be liberated and ultimately go into glycogen stores. But in the beginning, once again, I do think, and again, this is just from experience, myself and others, in that first month, I think too high of protein can be detrimental. I do think it slows it down. So better than like keeping your fats super high, just drop your protein a little bit, let the fats kind of be the bulk of it, go for the cheeses, go for the bacon, go for the meat, go for the fattier cuts of meat, but don't try to load up on protein too much.
And to add another layer for those who are trying to kind of dig into the nuance of what Tom is saying here, is that there's studies back to the 1983 by Collier and Odile actually, where they were actually looking at the glucose and insulin response of various foods. And they were comparing 50 grams of potatoes, 50 grams of chicken breast, with or without fat. And what they were finding was that when you provide 50 grams of potatoes and you compare it to 50 grams of chicken breast, calorically equivalent, that protein has 2.5 times less of a glucose and insulin response, more specifically insulin response. And so, obviously protein does have an insulin response, and we know that insulin can blunt ketogenesis. And so to your point, it does make sense that keeping protein under a controlled level would help enhance ketone production. But we also know that over time, we see that within the first 24 hours to 7 days, that once you lower insulin, which happens at the first meal, you see these progressive changes. One of the key changes that are happening is enzymatic changes in the fat, enzymatic changes in the liver. And these key signals, one is called lipolysis. So lipo meaning fat, lysis meaning breakdown. You're breaking down more fat. The enzymes that help facilitate that are enhanced because insulin's not blocking them from working. Insulin at the liver blocks fatty acid breakdown, what we call fatty acid oxidation, and also ketogenesis. Once you remove insulin from blocking those enzymes upregulate, and now increase the amount of fat burning in the liver and conversion over to ketone production as well. And we know that we see signals within the first 18 hours of ketone elevation. And I would argue, and maybe this is a point of discussion, because when we talk about tracking, you mentioned glucose, ketones, maybe someone, if they're worried about their weight, would also want to track their body weight, but those three being maybe the most essential over time for someone to see they're on a ketogenic diet. I would argue, when people talk about what's the magic ketone level, like what ketone level means I'm in ketosis, a lot of the numbers that is used historically is around 0.5 millimolar. Now, I reached out to some of the key researchers who I still work with and have worked with for the last 5-10 years and asked them, where'd that number come from? Because they're the ones who originally put it out there. And because I wasn't seeing any evidence that there was this clear magic number for any particular fact. And what they said was, look, this is a number we consistently saw when individuals adapted to a diet for long enough, around 4 weeks, when they start seeing all this normalization of this new normal, new higher fat burning potential, less reliance on carbohydrates, less glucose, less insulin, this new normal around the 4-week mark, that they're around 0.5 millimolar or more. That seemed to be the threshold we're seeing, but there was no magic number. But I kind of dug into that a bit more, Tom, over the last couple of years and really looked into what may be that magic number. And what I have found is the way I looked at it was when someone is on a high-carb diet versus a ketogenic diet, what is the distinguishable level seen between these two populations? And what I reliably see is in a fasted morning glucose finger prick or blood value in a laboratory setting, that when individuals get above 0.3 millimolar, you don't see individuals on a high carbohydrate diet reliably over overnight fast and first pricking their blood and testing their ketones usually don't get to 0.3 millimolar, but they certainly usually don't get above 0.3 millimolar. So what I contend or argue is that simply getting past that threshold is a distinguishable line in the sand between the literature and the evidence that says people on high carb diets range anywhere from 0.0 to 0.3 millimolar. But those who are on a ketogenic diet are from anywhere between 0.3 millimolar or above. And I've actually seen levels over 10 millimolar in some unique fasted settings. Not saying you should shoot for that high of the ketones. I don't think that's a good idea. But I would argue that that's the threshold, above 0.3 millimolar. Do you have a number that you think people should be shooting for when measuring blood ketone levels?
Yeah. So I think in that first month, a nice place to be, like, if you're really trying to get ketones high, which they might be high in that first month, because remember, there's an inefficiency. I'd say, like, getting to 1 is a great place, right? Like that's a nice number to be at. And then we could get into more detail with the GKI, but I think that's probably a little complex for this first phase to really talk about.
Yeah.
There's a lot of things that matters for. That's your glucose ketone index, like kind of this ratio. I have found that this is where you get into the nuance of what is better for actual fat loss versus performance versus cognitive, because it varies widely. And I was talking to Dr. Dom D'Agostino about this just off record. And, we both agree, and we both found that there's like this almost gray area of very low ketone state when you're probably burning the most actual body fat, and you're getting like a body composition change. And that actually tends to sit in that like 0.3 to 0.7 range, right? And then when you start going really high ketones, you're almost having like this self-limiting sort of system that's actually like you've got a high enough circulating that you're just, there's feedback loops that are probably changing how much actual fat you're burning. So just because you're creating more ketones doesn't necessarily mean you're burning more body fat per se, because it doesn't mean they all have to get oxidized. So I've found that, it's why a protein sparing modified fast works so well, right? It's like when you're actually limiting your fat intake, your ketones aren't insanely high on a protein sparing modified fast or rabbit starvation. They do it towards the end, like when the rabbit's actually literally close to starvation. But it's actually sitting in this like weird, like hovering zone, because there's like very little fat intake coming in. So it's, if you put yourself into this like fasted state, like where does it regulate at? It might be hard for you to measure as a type 1 diabetic because it would probably be distorted. But like even after like a 3-day fast, like my ketones aren't getting above like 2.5.
So actually on that point, and what's actually really cool about type 1 diabetes is that I can actually precipitously see when the insulin drops for me, because I have to administer it, right? And so what I reliably see, especially when people reach out, I'm like, can I even fast with type 1 diabetes? I'm not recommending this for anyone, but when I do it, what I see is that around 18 hours post an overnight fast, that my insulin levels reliably tank, usually because of probably a reduction in the amount of glucose output from the liver. Now it's come back low enough from the glycogen that was in the liver and stored. You're kind of tapering that off, and now you don't have that being released into the bloodstream, and so insulin is starting to come down. And so I actually see that I have to pull back my insulin around 50% at around 18 hours post overnight fast. So the first day of a fast. Then I find that within the 28 to 48 hour window of a fast, that I have to pull it even lower to around 33 to 25% of its original level. And then that kind of stays consistent, plus or minus 10 to 20% at that level over time. And that's actually very consistent with what we see with work all the way back to the 1960s and 1970s, that when they fasted individuals for over 30 days. What they found is that immediately after the final meal, glycogen was topped off. You use basically almost all of that glycogen within 24 hours. It's almost all gone. As a result, insulin comes down. Then your tissue's reliance on glucose also comes down, proportional to the glucose availability being lower and insulin being lower as well. So tissues stop relying on it as much. And that's why your body is shifting over to this alternative substrate. It's trying to supplement all this, the body's tissues needs, even on a fast or even on a low carbohydrate based diet. It's trying to shift over to supply these other tissues with something besides just blowing it 100% with glucose. And so that's where you start to kind of get into this flexibility of being able to pull from other substrates, particularly the fat we have on our body, which we all have around. Most of us, actually, unfortunately in America, they probably have months and months of excess fat that they could survive off of. But we have an abundance of that, and that is on purpose so that we could survive periods of famine. But during this, let's say, shifting from this first early phase where we talk about all these key changes that are happening into this secondary phase, what we've seen in our studies is that you start to get to this point where you start to maximize the level of actual measurable fat oxidation. And that going up 100 to 200%, as we talked about, upwards of 300 to 400% for some of the unique hyper responders, so to speak. Carbohydrate oxidation comes down. We start to see that body weight loss, particularly sodium excretion, and just the water loss alone coming down and normalizing at that stage. Are there other things that you've experienced within that first 4-week window before things really reliably start to normalize for most people? What else have you seen within that first 4 weeks people should be aware of?
From a performance standpoint, a slight decline in explosivity, right? So lifting, that might not be applicable to everybody, but like a little performance dip, right? Yeah. I would say an increase in endurance. I notice quite a significant increase there, maybe towards the latter part of that 4-week period. I'd say in the first week, endurance kind of tanks a little bit because there's probably some reliance on, glucose as I'm transitioning there.
Yeah.
I would say cognitively, a little fogginess that first couple days, 3-4 days. And then after that, it's like exponential hockey stick up in cognitive, sometimes almost too much. I would say in that first month, a little bit of some sleep issues as my body's kind of like recalibrating, but then sort of settles on this place where I actually just need a tad less sleep in general, right? So where I would normally require 7 to 8, I would say I typically, in a deep ketogenic state, within the first 3 weeks, it quickly goes to a new baseline of requiring about 6 to 7. That's, again, there are some studies to back that up. I know we can get into like the PPAR stuff I've seen the rodent stuff, which is really interesting. Like PPAR actually like increasing wakefulness in these mice where they like require half the sleep with the same level and have like the same level of arousal and everything during the day. It's pretty wild stuff. But I'd say that's, those are really the strong ones, and I want to move into this second phase because assuming people got through this first phase, which I think that most people do, you have like a big washout period in the first week. And then I would say most people that don't wash out in the first week usually end up lasting, 8 weeks or more, right? It's like that first week is that's a good point. Yeah. That's the washout. Like if you're going to quit, you're going to quit in the first week. Otherwise, most people usually last a couple of months. And, as we continue with this, like that second phase is really important. And then that third phase is really, really important because we're going to get into fat adaptation and then keto adaptation, which is not the same as fat adaptation. And if I recall, keto adaptation takes a little longer, right? So what happens as we enter in this, like what's happening in the human body as we enter the second phase?
So the changes we saw in the first 24 to 7 days are progressive, right? From the best of our knowledge, we think at this stage that the liver glycogen begins to normalize within the first, let's say, 4 weeks. So within the first 7 to 21 days, that would begin to normalize back up again once, on this ketogenic diet. Then you would see this ramp up in total body fat use. So you're breaking down more of your fat, you're utilizing more of your fat. Your reliance on carbohydrates is also coming down as well. And those are really the progressive changes that we're starting to see over time. That's really the second phase for me. And I think when people get into that kind of almost like you ramp up and then you're kind of smoothing and gliding. And that's kind of the I would say almost the in-between phase between first the major changes in the first 7 days, particularly the first 24 hours. And then it's kind of almost like you're landing this plane, so to speak, or taking off and getting to a level of new height. And then you start to begin to transition to the third phase. So I call the second phase more of like a gliding phase. Would you see it the same way?
Yeah. It's sort of this, not a heck of a lot of additional adaptation that's occurring in that second phase.
Yeah. It seems to mostly be, from what we see in our studies, a progression. So like the things that are already happening, they're starting to get to their new levels of normal. They're starting to reach maximum levels of ketone production. The glucose is starting to initially plummets down. It starts to come to a new normal. And levels of free fatty acids initially spike up, and then they start to normalize as well. That's actually happening around the 7-day mark onwards. Things like triglycerides drop pretty quickly. HDL comes up. LDL seems to shift from these kind of small, dense to large, buoyant forms of LDL. And these all seem to be happening within the first 21 days. And that's where you're kind of gliding to this new level where you kind of pass into what I would call a third phase, which is this 4-week window or more for most people. That 4 weeks is going to shift left to right, depending on how fast you would adapt. We see in athletes that we reliably see that most of these things normalize around the 4-week mark. However, I think for those who are not an athlete or maybe less metabolically flexible going into the diet, maybe it shifts a week or two. Maybe it takes a little bit more time to get to that state. But then I would say past that moment, you get into this new state of normal. And I typically say the 4-week line. The reason I say that is because we've done a number of studies in different populations, and we've actually tracked these metabolites every single day over 4 to 6 plus weeks, where we're controlling almost every variable of their diet, their body composition, their physical activity. And what we see is that when tracking using these really refined, almost minute by minute measurements of their blood metabolites, that after the 3-week mark, ketones get to peak levels for most people and plateau. We see that in fast too. Around a 30-day window of fast, beta-hydroxybutyrate will get to around, on average for people who are fasting, around 5-6 millimolar and sit there and plateau on a fast. At least that was shown back in the 1960s by George Cahill. Then you see that we also see that glucose levels have this dramatic shift in lowering initially, but then they get to a plateau around the 4-week mark. And that aligns with nitrogen balance normalization. Nitrogen balance is when your muscles are breaking down, they produce more nitrogen because of ammonium, and then you release it. And this basically muscle protein turnover. We see that when ketones elevate, because it's actually something I studied very intimately during graduate school, is the impact of ketones directly on muscle. And we see that ketone bodies appear to have a very reliable impact on blocking muscle breakdown. So when this block or this normalization of muscle or our nitrogen levels, which is a surrogate marker of muscle tissue breakdown and turnover, we see that when ketones hit peak levels, that normalizes as well. So we're seeing a lot of new normals. Okay, fat oxidation is reaching peak levels and normalizing post 21 days. For most studies have shown that. Reliance on carbohydrates are coming down around 50% to 100%. We're seeing peak levels and then new peak sustainment of blood ketone levels. We see glucose levels come down and then hit a plateau of new normal at the 4-week mark. We see that aligns with when we know that muscle turnover begins to now hit a new normal. I would argue that that's the dividing line, because we also see that this is aligned with objective functional change. So when athletes, all the way back to the 1980s by a study from Steve Phinney, and I actually got to sit down and talk really intimately with Steve Phinney about his studies back in the day, and because he's one of the pioneers in this field in the 1980s looking at athletes and performance. And he said, within the first week or two of the diet, these athletes would really see an impaired performance, or around after the 3-week to at the 4-week mark, they would come right back up and they would hit this new level of physical performance again. And that's what we're also seeing, because there was a lot of studies from 2017 to 2021, a really prominent group, Louise Burke's group, John Hawley's group. They do some really rigorous work. They were looking at Olympic athletes who are elite race walkers. And what they were finding is when they put them on a ketogenic diet from 5 to 21 days, that they would rapidly see elevations in ketone bodies, their fat oxidation would go up, their carb oxidation would go down, but they would see like this marginal reduction in performance, around 2%. So not what most people would even see in real world. However, that for an elite athlete in the Olympics, that might be first or second place. But what we were curious about was, we know all these metabolite changes, all these enzymatic changes and tissue changes, many of them take at least 3 weeks to hit a new normal. And that's what we saw. We saw that when we actually got Ironman competitors, people who completed an Ironman or still competing in Ironman, doing 100 kilometers of exercise, very high levels of fitness, let me put it that way. And when we looked at these athletes, when we put them on the diet for 6 weeks, we found that at the 4-week mark, they hit a new normal. And they were that new normal was aligned with this no deterioration in long-term strenuous exercise performance with aerobic exercise, or basically a time to exhaustion trial, a hitting the wall trial. But we see the same thing in athletes when we're doing short duration, high intensity work. So I think that 4-week mark is a key measure of not only tissue specific changes, metabolite changes, fat oxidation changes, but also functional physical performance change. And so a lot of times when I think about this, Tom, and how does that relate to someone actually thinking about, well, what does that matter to me? What matters to you, because that is when you could expect to see a complete new normal. Yeah. And that's what I think when people go on this journey, I say, what have you changed your macronutrients? Are you prepared for that? Do you know what that's going to look like for you? Do you have all the tools to track over time? Do you have the things like sodium, if you need potassium, magnesium, supplementation along the way, to mitigate any like keto flu symptoms from sodium excretion? And then when is that point where you'd expect to feel this new normal? And I would say that the new normal is expected to be reached, based on all the evidence we see, for most people around the 4-week mark, or slightly more than that. Give or take individual variability. Would you agree with that, or do you see it differently?
Yeah, and if you think about it from an athlete, they're testing that. They're pushing the envelope to test that. But that doesn't mean that in someone that's not an athlete, like they're not recalibrating to a new baseline too, right? So it's the only reason that an athlete sees it is because they're more apt to measure it. They're more apt to put themselves in a scenario where they're going to see but we all go through our own bouts of, performance in our daily lives, right? We just don't measure it. We don't think about it. Our resilience to stress, resilience to, crazy kids at home that are pushing you to the limit with your stress, like these immeasurable things that are happening transiently and just like acutely throughout the day, that you don't necessarily measure your micro reactions. But the fact that you now have a new baseline, like you can translate this directly into just the regular person that's not an athlete. They're having that same level of adaptation, just within their respective domain. We're just seeing it more so, with the athletes, because we're testing them. How do you test, a stay-at-home mom that just feels a lot better with her kids and has more mental energy, other than just subjective cues, right? So I think that's important for people to know. Like, this is like a Goldilocks period of where you're really, or not, I shouldn't say Goldilocks, but this is like that transition period has now stabilized. And, this is where things feel really good, right? And then as you kind of continue on to this like 8-week mark, sometimes that can be what throws people a little bit, because it's like, now I think there's an element of metabolic change, but there's also like a psychological adaptation that's happened to this. Like the honeymoon period is over, right? Now you're not, but I think that's good and bad, right? Because, you're dropping this water weight, you're feeling good, you're adapting to really new body composition, and probably sometimes 5, 10, 15 pounds less water. Your face looks good. You're feeling all this stuff. You're seeing these improvements, and then all of a sudden you get to this period where other things can come into play. And we'll talk about them, like, peripheral insulin resistance, where maybe you start to see these numbers climb up a little bit and it's throwing you off. So I think like phase 3 is a really important phase to talk about, because I see people get discouraged there because sometimes the body composition results kind of slow down a little bit there. But I think it's important to note, and I'll let you take it from here, is like, this is when you have reached adaptation and like you're getting serious actual metabolic changes that are occurring. Quickly before we get into phase 3, a lot of people that listen to this show are really into just the mitochondria in general.
Yeah.
During this, like, say 4 to 8 week period, what have you seen in the lab? What is happening mitochondrially? Because we know we can skip the phase 1 on the mitochondria. I'm sure it's a lot of just shifting in enzymatic function, developing a little bit more like recalibrating metabolic machinery to use fats, maybe down regulating some of these glucose transporters and increasing, CPT and all these other things that bring fat in. But what about during that 4 to 8 week mark? Like, what have you seen given the mitochondrial half-life being like 6 weeks or so? So like sometimes right in between that 4 to 8 week period, we should be having like monumental change, or at least marked change in the mitochondria.
So it's interesting because the mitochondria is a very interesting hot topic, but usually so to actually measure the mitochondria, you have to use these. You typically have to pull cells from tissue, put them in a petri dish, extract out the mitochondria using multiple laboratory-based chemicals and enzymatic reactions, and then you put them into this machine where you actually knock in and knock out pathways of the electron transport chain, which is a part. It's using often called a seahorse. People can Google this. And this is where you can kind of look at mitochondrial efficiency or oxidative biomarkers, more of a advanced laboratory assessment technique. That's usually more of the refined scope of what we would expect to look at when we think of mitochondria. However, most people aren't going to that level, but it doesn't mean you can't extract what that actually might be doing, or extrapolate from the changes we do see that might be happening in, let's say, the mitochondria. So for example, oxidative stress, one of the key areas where oxidative stress is produced is from the mitochondria. We know that just metabolic efficiency, I think it's Michael Picard, he does some really remarkable work on mitochondrial work more so around the mental health and brain function space. And it's really fascinating to look at the resolution of this very unique organelle, which basically is where we produce energy. And so we know that organelle produces a lot of energy through this electron transport chain. And the electron transport chain, at least key components of it, are reliant on oxygen and or aerobic metabolism. And we know that one of the key metabolites that is highly dependent on that is fat-based oxidation. And so when you're getting into a higher level of fat oxidation, you would expect that aspect is being run efficiently and at least in a high capacity, right? But a lot of the times we're not actually looking at the mitochondria itself. You have to have some really refined techniques all the way down to the cellular mitochondrial level using these advanced laboratory techniques. We're looking at other things like oxidative stress or measures of efficiency during exercise or some other type of measurement like that. And so I feel I can say, we see measures that we would see improvements in mitochondrial function. However, it's not so clear cut as to exactly how efficient or lack thereof the mitochondria actually are on these particular types of diets. But we know that you can administer ketone bodies into these settings and look at their response and their energetic efficiency. And so there are different ways of looking at it, but I haven't seen a lot on the direct effect here. But we would expect, based on other biomarkers, that that in theory you would think it would be improving its efficiency. But the truth is, I don't know that answer.
Is it, I mean, when people say that ketones essentially can sort of, backdoor enter into a mitochondria, right? Like when potentially like one that's not efficient at using glucose. If you have a dysfunctional mitochondria and it's not able to really use glucose and it's kind of on its last legs, if you rekindle that and allow a ketone to go in there and sort of like actually provide, fuel essentially, can it, from what this is a question that I've been wondering, can it bring that mitochondria back to life in a way?
Interesting question. Another one where I don't know the answer to that because
I haven't been able to find the answer. Like, it's like, because what good is like getting fuel into a mitochondria that's dysfunctional if it doesn't actually like rekindle it and bring it back to life outside of just, okay, this gives me more energy. But is that mitochondria going to be shackled to a life of only being able to use ketones? Or can it, like, once the ketones reinvigorate it, does it actually light that some of it back up to the point where if you're not on the ketogenic diet, it's functioning again?
I would almost answer in a slightly different way that I think may be very applicable to the audience and understanding why it's important to potentially shift away from just always consuming very high carbohydrate diets all the time, or what may be the benefit of shifting away from that. We know that, examples like in fasting, where you remove calories significantly, most of those are coming from carbohydrates because that's the predominant caloric source for most people, that there are these powerful effects on cells all the way down to the mitochondrial level. And those shifts seem to be particularly important for normal biological and cellular processes, oftentimes that most people are never tapping into because they're never doing anything but the same habitual, for most people, high carbohydrate-based diet. And so I think it's particularly important for people to go through phases, whether it be a fast or a diet that's really reducing carbohydrates, to shift all the way down to, at the final level, the mitochondria, where the sources of nutrients are coming from. There's some interesting work out of Walter Longo's group out of fast and mimicking diets that if you reduce the amount of nutrients or available nutrients, that there's this powerful shift in stem cell function, and reintroducing calories after like a 5-day window of that can have powerful effects on a number of pathological processes. It could potentially even augment cancer standard of care. They're currently looking at this right now in breast cancer patients. And so another way of looking at that question, at least the way that I often think about it from what I'm familiar with, is that I think it's important for people to get out of just a static nutrient path and allow your body to be forced to flex into other forms of nutrients. One of the reasons we think that athletes experience, greater health benefits is people talk about this metabolic flexibility. What are they talking about? They're really talking about mitochondrial ability to flex between fuel substrates. And one way to potentially assess that we do in the labs, particularly in exercise setting, is to actually look at whole body fuel use. And what we find is that when individuals are on these high carbohydrate based diets, that they're highly glycolytically dependent, even at low levels of intensity. So meaning like even at moderate to low levels of exercise intensity where you think fat would be the predominant fuel substrate, we actually see people are highly glucose dependent, illustrating that how we think about metabolic flexibility and the new age of almost everyone having some form of metabolic dysfunction in the developed world. I think it's particularly important for people to force their way out of that, to be forced into utilizing alternative substrates, to, in essence, challenge the body, a lot like an exercise bout challenges the body, at least for a short window of time. These things are important. I think that I think that's one of the reasons why these diets can be very powerful and helpful. But keep in mind, when you're on a ketogenic diet and we see these dramatic increases in fat oxidation and reduced reliance on carbohydrates, the reason I use the word reliance is because it doesn't mean that you're not using carbohydrates anymore. You're still using some carbohydrates, and now you're using much more fat. It's actually more of an even balance. Mm-hmm. Whereas before, you're extremely predominantly glucose dependent. and very little fat is being utilized. So what we found in the athletes that we've studied, because this is where we're actually looking at whole body fat use and whole body carbohydrate use, at least burning, we see there's more of a balance when individuals have adapted to a ketogenic diet between these two fuel substrates. In fact, you see this in world record holders in Ironman competitions where despite consuming higher forms of carbohydrates and a ton of carbs during the exercise bout, around 4 hours into an Ironman competition, like world record times around 8 hours, around the halfway mark, their body is forced into a predominance of fat oxidation, a little over 50%. So their body is still, regardless of what you're fueling at, when the demand is high enough, the body will shift towards utilizing a degree of fat in these settings. And so I think that it's important to have a combination of both and be able to utilize both. And we know that when we look at the athletes that we have in the lab setting, there's more of a balance when individuals have gone through a ketogenic diet. And maybe that's just because, Tom, so many people are consuming these very high glucose, sometimes often very processed forms of rapidly elevating glucose and insulin level types of foods. And just getting away from that to a new normal is oftentimes maybe a beneficial thing. But yeah, that's the way I look at it.
So what about as we move into, phase 3? Because there's a pretty significant shift that happens after like that 8-week period. What's happening there?
So I think most of the major rapid changes have occurred. But I also want to highlight that you mentioned this effect of kind of like the honeymoon period's over. Well, yeah, because you're seeing all these rapid changes so quickly and you're like, okay, well, I'm expecting to still see these rapid changes. Well, no, I think you've reached a new normal at this phase. However, there are some things that are still prolonged beyond that period. There's like around 12 different, or I think around 15 different known biological changes that occur associated with just shifting around macronutrients, particularly from a high-carb diet to a ketogenic diet. Some of those persist beyond the 4-week window. One of those is that we don't see a complete normalization of things like muscle glycogen per se, even beyond the 12-week mark. Now, I would contend, based on our evidence, that's not important for performance on these diets specifically. But we know that there's some changes that are a little less studied, a little less appreciated, that do extend beyond the 8-week mark, because we do see that appetite regulation changes rapidly in the first 7 days, but reaches a new normal around the period of time that you're describing when people get past this honeymoon phase. There's the new level of appetite, a new level of satiety in response to foods. And we see all those occur around this window of time past the 4-week mark, or around or past the 4-week mark. So there's still ongoing changes. In fact, the one study that actually shows a complete normalization of muscle glycogen in athletes is a study from Jeff Volek called the FASTER study, where they brought in some of the best athletes in the entire world. And those athletes were habituating or sticking with this ketogenic diet for 9 to 36 months, depending on the athlete themselves. And they were completely normal muscle glycogen levels. They utilized muscle glycogen during exercise. They resynthesized it just the same as someone on a high-carb diet once they habituated to the diet long enough. And so you see that once you get into this full-fledged adapted stage, that you're able to leverage and utilize a lot of the same processes that you were before that, but now you're at a much higher level of fat burning. You're at a much lower reliance on carbohydrate during most of the day, but particularly even during exercise. You're going through less glucose swings, less insulin swings as well. But one other thing you brought up was this potential of or I think what you're referring to is physiologic insulin resistance. Mm-hmm. So this idea of, most people think of insulin resistance as what it is, which is a very negative thing on health, right? You have, and it's associated with type 2 diabetes, where people they produce high levels of insulin. The insulin just isn't able to bring glucose into the cell, and there's resistance. And that resistance is multifold. It's because of high levels of insulin in the peripheral vasculature, okay? Meaning these peripheral blood vessels, when they are exposed to high levels of insulin, they develop insulin resistance on the peripheral tissues. What are the peripheral tissues? The muscle and fat tissues. We also know that high levels of insulin reduce the receptor, almost like a dulling effect to too much stimulus. on the actual receptor itself. We also see that there's actual changes within insulin signaling with insulin resistance. That is pathological insulin resistance with type 2 diabetes. There's this other phenomenon called physiologic insulin resistance, where when you start to, and I think that's probably a bad term, and to be honest with you, what is happening is that when individuals are becoming adapted to high levels of fat, when you consume an abundance of glucose, you may not see the same level of glucose uptake immediately into tissue. So some people would contend that that is, oh, well, that means it's insulin resistance. It's like, no, you're just shifting towards a higher level of fat predominance, a lower reliance on carbohydrates. But now all of a sudden, if you just throw 75 grams of glucose, like in an oral glucose tolerance test, you're not going to see the same uptake because you've renormalized how you're utilizing fuels, and you're becoming less reliant on glucose and less reliant on the machinery to metabolize glucose. And so it makes sense that some individuals may experience, when they have a huge bolus of glucose, they may see actually a higher glucose level initially, and then what they think is called physiologic insulin resistance. Now, to back off that for a second, I also want to state that I think that comes from a place that is confusing for people, because things like these, like just bolusing back glucose levels, or like, oral glucose tolerance tests, these aren't even valid tests on low carbohydrate diets, because we know from over 100 years that those tests were never valid within low carbohydrate based settings. They relied on individuals being highly dependent on glucose for metabolism to be functional measurements of how you dynamically respond to glucose and insulin. So a lot of the ways that we view insulin, or the dynamic response to high glucose based foods, are completely contingent on methodological tools that were developed 100 years ago exclusively in high carbohydrate settings. So we don't have equivalent tool sets to look at those in the context of low carbohydrate ketogenic diet settings. So I don't think I think when people look at pathological insulin resistance and then physiologic insulin resistance, I don't like that comparison, because I think insulin resistance should be seen for what it is, which is a very bad pathological process that has consequences on cardiovascular health and beyond. Whereas physiologic insulin resistance is a term that's used to describe some degree of perceived resistance to insulin in response to a glucose-based bolus that isn't really a valid test in that setting to begin with. And so I think that term alone, I don't like that term, because I feel like it's not an appropriate use of the term insulin resistance and how we know that term ascribes to health. I think it confuses people.
Yeah, it does. And it's a very necessary, very good thing, because if you were to have a large bolus of carbohydrates and a large bolus of ketones at the same time, and the mitochondria was to be able to take all of that in at one time, that would be catastrophic too. You can't have this like overfeeding, so to speak, right? So it's like it's keeping things in check. It's not just you've use it or lose it type. Right? It's not just because, okay, you're eating fats, now your cells are losing the ability to use glucose. Like, this is a very delicate balance that your body's keeping in check, so that you're not having like an overabundance of, both fuels at one time. I know there's some studies on, I think, the PKR response or something like that, where it's just like, if you have too much fuel coming in at once to the mitochondria, it can cause a major like inflammatory state. Because the mitochondria was taking in, if you had a 75 gram bolus of glucose, and you also had a surplus of ketones floating around at the same time, and the mitochondria was able to take both of those in. We have to think of it as, getting a little bit like into the weeds here, but the mitochondria is essentially like a battery with its two sort of like voltage changes, and how it actually cross the membrane and everything like that. So it's like, if you have so much going into that, so much charge going into that, that can actually disrupt the entire function of a mitochondria. So it's actually regulating the fuel and regulating the charge in a certain way. So I think when you start getting down to even like a quantum level of how that is working, it's really, really important to know that this is like protecting you and helping you. If you were to be as glucose sensitive or insulin sensitive as you would be not on a ketogenic diet, it would probably cause a really effed up state in your body, just to put it bluntly.
And to kind of, when you talk about the kind of fundamentals of a ketogenic diet, a lot of people would probably ask the question, and because they've probably heard of it, of exogenous ketone bodies. Yeah. And this is something that I have personally studied for over a decade now, and worked in labs where we developed novel ketone formulations. We've tested them in disease models of cancer, to how it affects the muscle, to how it affects brain and cognition in humans, to elite level military personnel and extreme environments. So we looked at it in all different sorts of settings. What is your take on the use or lack thereof of exogenous ketones with your experience? Like, what do you personally do? And if you do, what type would you use and when would you use it?
Yeah. I think the world of exogenous ketones is a very fascinating one. And I would probably say the number one use of exogenous ketones for me is to, and this is, it also was confirmed by Dom D'Agostino last week when we were talking about, like, the best way to use these is when you're doing, let's say, periodic fast or periodic bouts of very low carb. It allows you to sort of extend the benefits of that low carb diet beyond just the state of that low carb diet. So put it this way, like, there's things that are a little bit more advanced practices, like, targeted ketogenic diet, things like that, or even a cyclical ketogenic diet. The evidence is starting to show out of some of the work in Dom's lab too, is that, like, realistically, you can do a ketogenic diet for a few months, and then you could take a month off of a ketogenic diet, still eating good foods, and use exogenous ketones and actually continue much of the benefit. But it has to come with, like, this adaptation period, because if you were to just do a ketogenic diet for a week or two and then rely on exogenous ketones, you wouldn't get the benefit, right? So that's what I have instinctively done for years, is if I go off of a ketogenic diet, I will still continue to supplement with exogenous ketones, and they seem to not have the same effect after about 4 weeks of doing that. So that's, I think, just a more advanced use. But I think exogenous ketones still have, like, really powerful effects when it comes to the brain, right? That's where we're seeing it for the most part. Is a lot of the studies on schizophrenia, the studies on bipolar disorder, like, we're seeing really cool things with supplying exogenous, BHB being able to, like, help sort of rekindle some of this brain mitochondria. So I think for me, I almost exclusively use them, with the exception of what I just mentioned before, if I'm just looking for additional cognitive load or cognitive function, right? If I feel like I'm under a lot of cognitive load. Depends on the type of ketone body. I think we can get into and type of ketone delivery, whether it's a diester, monoester, triester, ketone salt, racemic, whatever. That is definitely more complex and probably a different video altogether. But I find that, if I'm doing a long duration exercise, a little bit of exogenous ketones along with a little bit of glucose, like, seems to be like quite a performance edge. And that's creating a super physiological state, right? You're never going to have high levels of insulin and high levels of ketones at the same time. So you're creating, like, this super state where, yeah, I can find, like, that in those, like, metabolic gray areas of a workout. We could save this for a performance topic, really, but like a CrossFit type workout where you're in that, like, friggin' death zone, that metabolic purgatory, like, a lot of aerobic, but high upper aerobic, just terrible, like 800-meter type stuff, right? That is where the co-ingestion of carbohydrates and exogenous ketones seems to shine for me. It gives me, like, if I'm doing a ketogenic diet, sometimes I lack on that super upper threshold, and that gives me an opportunity to be able to hit that. So for me, I just don't see a huge purpose unless someone has a very specific use for, like, TBI, brain issues, they want cognitive function, or then on the other side of the equation for the athlete. I don't think the average person needs to supplement with them unless they have a particular reason to.
And I think when you talk about the ketogenic diet, because you're already producing endogenous ketone bodies, right? Because a lot of the studies that we've done over the years, we've applied different forms of ketone formulations, whether it be salts or MCTs or these esters, which are all based on often based on 1,3-butanediol backbone, which is a molecule that goes all the way back to aerospace use back in the 1960s. So these molecules have been around for quite a long period of time. Some of the more novel formulations have come up more recently, but some of the work that we've done, we've seen that even applying, ketone bodies in healthy individuals can improve, your accurate response rate in like a reading challenge. And what we actually found is that they were responding faster by going to, like, let's say 700 milliseconds to 600 down to 600 milliseconds. And that same group, when they would exercise, they would have that same effect, going from 700 milliseconds to 600 milliseconds. And that was fascinating to me. I'm like, okay, just taking this alone seemed to mirror some of the cognitive measures, not all of them, but some of the cognitive measures we see with exercise. Because exercise is one of the most potent exercise or cognitive enhancing activities you can do. We've also done some studies with the Department of Defense looking at, this was something with, at the time, was HVMN. They're now known as Ketone IQ. We were utilizing a molecule with 1,3-butanediol and also combined with beta-hydroxybutyrate combined together. And when you ingest that, you break off the beta-hydroxybutyrate, and 1,3-butanediol is digested into a ketone body in the liver. And what we found is in hypoxic settings that we found that those molecules not only enhanced oxygen uptake, but also but actually also improved cognition at the same time. And this was at 15,000 feet and 20,000 foot altitude. It also increased vigilance, which is a measure more typically measured in military settings. Is this idea of sustained attention on a task and getting specific accurate or response rates. And one of the most common things we see is cognitive efficiency measurements. But we actually have a number of ongoing projects with just looking at the simple backbone molecule itself, and everyone's got their take on what should be applied when on just the 1,3-butanediol based molecule, looking at things like sleep or liver function in some disease settings as well, and where there might be an applicable state or use for that. And on an actual personal level, like I have type 1 diabetes, and some things that can happen at times, although it's much less now that I actually do follow a ketogenic diet and have for over a decade, is you can still get hypoglycemia. But there was some literature that's come out that had actually shown that when you rescue hypoglycemia, so low glucose availability in the blood and also in the brain, that if you not just give glucose, but you also give it with a ketone body, that you can enhance cognition faster and rescue faster out of that low brain energy state. And I think that ascribes to a lot of what we've seen over the years, that one of the most common effects of these molecules is their cognitive enhancing or performance components, which also aligns with one of the first ways we knew about this diet. The first way we knew about this diet was obesity, type 2 diabetes, and type 1 diabetes. But in 1921, there was a published study from Wilder from the Mayo Clinic, and they showed that ketogenic diet could model some anti-seizure effects. But we've also, in laboratory settings, utilizing molecules that have, again, that 1,3-butanediol backbone with molecules like acetoacetate, that combination, when you induce oxygen toxicity seizures, so seizures induced by high levels of oxygen that might be experienced when you breathe 100% oxygen under seawater, something that military personnel might experience at the elite end, that when you apply these molecules, you could delay the onset of seizure sometimes 200 to 500%. Quite remarkable stuff. And so, but I've become more and more convinced that these molecules are most applicable in the cognitive environment for enhancing that. But it doesn't necessarily require, per se, a ketogenic diet to see some of those effects, because most of these studies that we've done have actually been on a non-ketogenic diet setting. So it's kind of interesting, because most of the work on ketogenic diets or exogenous ketones and the combination thereof is actually not in humans, it's in animal models. Okay. And so it'll be interesting to see what comes out of that. But I don't use exogenous ketones all the time because I'm on a ketogenic diet. But if I were to use it, it's oftentimes because from things like cognitive components, particularly when trying to rescue low glucose environments in the brain, to provide an enhancement and kind of a new normal. I also find them to be absolutely fascinating molecules. We know that they have, just applying ketones in and of themselves exogenously can profoundly change metabolism, glucose metabolism, lactate metabolism, increase ketone levels to levels that you would experience with fasting or ketogenic diets over days and weeks. It happens within minutes, right? We also see that it changes how your genes are expressed. It has an anti-inflammatory response, an antioxidant response.
immune system.
Yeah.
I mean, and I will honestly go on record and say that out of everything that I've ever used, minus maybe like ketamine in a controlled situation, exogenous ketones have rescued me from very depressed states before.
Interesting.
Like as far as a mood lift. So, and that's pretty evident too. Like when we obviously know the stuff we've talked about, and Dom and I were talking about this, how it's essentially allowing for a better conversion of glutamate to GABA, so it's getting you out of these like anxious, like sort of like doom and gloom states into this more calm, copacetic, everything's cool. And that's quick. And that is something that is quick. And so I think that there are, when I say like it's these, extreme is the wrong word, but it's like the upper end of everything, right? So it's like when you're looking for more cognition, like we've used it in SOCOM with marksmen, right? Like it's like that was the first thing that I brought in with the Department of Defense. It's like, okay, working with these people. So it's like the upper end of everything, but it kind of comes back to what we were talking about before with the phase 2 stuff is everyone has a respective upper end, whatever it is, right? Everyone's living in their own reality with their own relativity based on them. So it's like what, SOCOM marksman's top upper end might be very different from a stay-at-home mom's upper end, but they're both each person's respective upper end, right? So I find that ketos just get you that additional performance edge in whatever end that might be, if that makes sense, right? So it's like for me, maybe it's when I'm on camera and I just need to click on more and it's a marked difference, or when I'm in the gym, or, but it's not going to be something that I'm going to do to just say like, I'm just going to get through the day and sip on some ketones. There's usually a deliberate purpose.
I actually agree with that, because a lot of the evidence on some of these molecules are around, our anaerobic performance, and some of the other settings around, because we actually wrote a review in Sports Medicine 2023 with Brendan Egan, who has done a lot of this work as well, and kind of,
he's a guy out in Ireland, right?
Yeah. And just a remarkable guy, a remarkable researcher, worked with his students, multiple of his students in the past, and some of these military studies that we've done. And what we find is that they might not always be required in any particular setting. They're not like, nothing here we're talking about is like magic, right? Mm-hmm. These are just tools in a toolbox that can be applied for a specific purpose. When we talked about the ketogenic diet, we know that for 200 years, it could prevent and reverse obesity, type 2 diabetes, and help dramatically improve the lives of people with type 1 diabetes. We know it can alleviate symptoms of Parkinson's, Alzheimer's, cognitive decline. We know there's preliminary evidence, and people can look this up, called Think Smart, out of Metabolic Mind Group, about all these amazing examples of people going to remission with bipolar, schizophrenia, depression, with actual observational analysis coming out showing these effects. So that might be a purpose for why you go out, administer a ketogenic diet, if you're trying to improve or maximize your health, so to speak. And then there's this other end where, when we talk about, do you apply things like exogenous ketone bodies, or what do you do with them? And I think they have their own place in this toolkit for deliberate purposes. If you're trying to, there's some evidence, but it's very specific about when you would apply them and where you see performance enhancing effects. When would they be applied? What's a smart strategy for applying it? What molecule do you apply and when? I've become increasingly convinced that I think just the elevations of ketone bodies themselves is one of the most important things you can experience. And so finding cost-efficient tools that do that is I think just an important thing for people to think about when they are trying these things. Because the reality is that, and I always say this, so Tom, a lot of times when we talk about, ketogenic diet and how you implement them, the changes that happen over time, what do you need to do this diet successfully? What do you track? What do you expect to see happening over time? One of the important things is talking about what we see in science. And because science is one of the best tools we have to really try to understand how the world works in the best way possible. It doesn't give us all the answers, but it's the best tool we have to try to explain the world around us. But when we do science, let's say we did a study on 100 people doing a ketogenic diet versus a high-carb diet. What we often report in science, Tom, is the average outcome of all 100 people. But let's say you're Susan, and you were in that study, and you responded incredibly well to the diet. But let's say that the average outcome was like, 5% improvement, but you responded 10 to 15%. Does that mean that your 10 to 15% isn't real? No. Well, let's say you're the person down here who didn't respond well or didn't respond at all, and you're the other end of the outlier. Is your response not real just because a scientific publication for the average person says this is your outcome? No, that response is real for you. So one thing I always encourage people to appreciate is you'll see all these scientists saying, no, that's not real. Your response to this diet isn't real because look at this cited study over here in 20 people that showed that this diet does insert outcome. Except that for you, it may be very real because we're all unique individuals with variability. And the best way to determine whether something works or not is to, number one, try it. And number two, believe the results you got. Because if you respond well to it, you shouldn't just look at this study over here that we have that says, okay, that the response you got wasn't supposed to happen to you. No, it happened to you. And don't just continue to do something that may not be working for you just because a study said it should be working for you. So you have to, number one, try it. And number two, trust the results that you're getting from it as long as you're doing it the right way. And hopefully they'll have enough resources from this video to navigate that the best way possible.
And, we have a lot of other videos, and I'll also link out to some of the other videos that you and I have done that give some of the other details and, more specifics of, macronutrients and everything. And of course, Andrew, where can everyone find you?
It's super cool to be here, Tom. As always, man, people can find me at andrewkoutnik.com. I provide a lot of free resources there. Or if you ever want to try to contact me for some reason, there's a contact portal there. I also try to do more on Instagram and YouTube at Andrew Koutnik, PhD. Those are the usernames there. And I'm also active on X or Twitter, whatever you want to call it, at AKOUTNIK, Koutnik. So people can find me there.
Right on, man. You the man.
All right. Appreciate it, Tom.